With that, I would like to invite the first speaker. It will be Steve Kelling from eBird and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, speaking about informing bird conservation at multiple spatial scales. He'll be followed by Eric Mata, who is the director of the Encyclopedia of Life, a really exciting global initiative about bringing knowledge together about species. And finally, Gerardo Ceballos will talk about conservation at global scales. I'm really excited about the high caliber set of speakers we've brought together for the symposium. And everybody, please join me in welcoming Steve Kelling from Cornell. Thanks.
Thanks, Walter. Am I loud enough? I think I'm too loud. Should I keep talking until that sounds better? The one thing I'd like to add to what Walter said was not only are spatial scales important, but what I'm going to try to do today is prove to you that temporal scales are also. And being able to look both spatially and temporally across a broad range of different scales is what I want to focus my talk on. And the underlying hypothesis of the work that I'm going to describe to you is that if we can gather sufficiently large quantities of data with relatively low per datum information, so the kind of data that you would get from a volunteer network, citizen scientists, we believe we can accurately then estimate species distributions across broad spatial and temporal scales. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is describe a volunteer network that we've developed to gather these observations. I'm going to then briefly explain our observational data model and the cyber infrastructure that maintains that, because that's a key component of making all this functional. And then finally, I'll describe some basic research in computer science, statistics, and ecology, which have led to measurable conservation outcomes. So for the past 200 years in the United States, volunteers have participated significantly in ornithology. And beginning in the early 2000s, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and National Audubon Society developed a project called eBird, which was developed to take advantage of newly emerging, at the time, information technologies to engage bird watchers to submit observations to a central database. So the goal of eBird is to allow anybody to submit an observation of a bird anywhere in the world. And this graphic shows you 1 day of observations submitted to eBird back in March 2011. Now what we do with eBird is we've created a checklist program. So observers don't send us information about single birds, but they send us information in the form of a checklist where we require certain pieces of information to allow us to standardize the way people collect those observations. So for example, we collect the who, what, where, how many, how long, and what distance they may have traveled, as well as a question about whether they're reporting all the birds that they've observed. So based on that as our data model and all of our protocols set up like that, over the past 9 years we've been able to gather around 7 million checklists and 100 million observations. So who's submitting all of these data? Well, depending on where you read, there are tens to hundreds of millions of people who are bird watchers globally. Many of the more serious bird watchers like to keep lists of birds and checklists when they go out. And the top of those even collect more information very specific about birds and keep detailed notes about the observations they've made. So we've taken advantage of that with eBird and have developed a website where they can contribute their observations. Or more recently, you can see on the bottom, your bottom left, we've developed, in partnerships with other groups, applications that allow us to collect data directly from iPhones and other handheld devices. So what we've done with eBird is develop a community of participants by providing that community with all the features that bird watchers or birders like to have when they participate in birding. One of the major things birders love are life lists and lists of birds. So eBird allows them to keep life lists of their world lists or their favorite country lists or state lists or county lists or backyard lists or bathroom lists. There's all kinds of different lists that birders like to have and keep and maintain, and we allow them to do that all through the application. Birders also like to see their names and how their names rank and their observations rank with their friends and people in very specific regions. So we provide various kinds of data visualizations where they can see how they rank compared to other people's ranks in either the number of checklists they've submitted for a region or number of species they've observed. Then we also allow them to play games, and this yard list game is one in which it's a global competition where people identify their backyards and then they submit repeatedly observations from their backyards. These kinds of competitions then are really great for us in the analysis of bird populations because we get repeated sightings from the same location by the same observer. So you can see that in Tompkins County, where Cornell is, I'm the best. And I have a lot of competition. I don't know if you know, you might recognize some of the names on that. The other thing about eBird is that we create a whole series of different data visualizations, real-time data visualizations, to allow people to see either through histograms like this or maps or graphs, patterns of bird populations at a variety of different scales. And bird watchers like these histograms in particular because it allows them to make decisions on what birds they might see on a trip that they're going to go to. So, for example, before I came to Yale, I looked at eBird and noticed that there was a wood sandpiper, which is a European vagrant in Rhode Island. So I found that through eBird, and after this conference, I think I'll go there and look at it. More importantly, though, these kinds of seasonal patterns and occurrence are used by land managers, particularly during migration, to establish water levels for waterfowl when they move through, and then lowering water levels when shorebirds come through. Now, there's no question that we have real issues with data quality, particularly in detectability and differences in the patterns in which one observer can identify birds versus the other. So what we've done to try to deal with this issue is we've recruited around 500 volunteers who have a separate website that allows them to vet and review the data that people submit, contact those observers, and roughly about 10% of the data that we currently get gets flagged for review, and about half of that gets rejected. Currently, we just received funding from the National Science Foundation to begin employing some new machine learning tools to allow us to begin to understand observer expertise better and use those in our models. eBird is based on a series of about 30 partners across global partners who coordinate activities in their states or countries, who've translated the eBird application into Spanish, French, and Portuguese, and work with us to develop techniques and functionality for the site. So the result is that eBird has been experiencing exponential growth since the start of the project. In fact, one of the interesting little tidbits is that during the month of May this past year, we collected more data in eBird than we did the first 3 years of the project. But there are holes, and this is a map showing all the locations globally where we have observations. And it sort of looks like a world map, but you can see like Brazil is empty and Africa needs work and Russia doesn't exist. So while we've made good progress in collecting data globally, and we still need to do more work to expand this. But what really is exciting to me personally is the fact that because the way that we collect eBird checklist data, people tell us how long they were in the field. We get an estimate then of how much time they've actually volunteered to participate in the project. This is, to me, a huge number of hours. So now I'm going to switch a little bit, because in order to make all of this kind of functionality run, you really need to develop and manage and maintain the expense of a data management infrastructure that allows you to develop and produce tools and functionality in the same time period that what people expect over the internet. So we've developed a data model that is a series of 4 relational tables that store all of our information on the location, who the observer was, the protocol information during the collection event, and then the species observation itself. And then from that particular set of tables, we can relate them together to quickly develop a series of data warehouses and other kinds of functionality to provide access to the data. The other thing that we've done is developed a more open architecture to allow application development. Initially, we just allowed in-house developers to create tools and functionality for eBird, but there was a request from the community for us to build APIs, programmer interfaces to our database to allow people in the community to develop applications. And now we have hundreds of different outcrops of applications that show rare birds in a region, or applications that show trends that these people have developed. Additionally, we've developed an API which we control more, where we allow people to actually input data into eBird. And that's led to the iPhone application and several applications like that. Finally, we're really committed to eBird to make this data openly available. And recently, we've switched our data access policy, where we've asked individuals to identify themselves and give us just a brief abstract of what they plan to do with the data. Currently, we get about 3 or 4 requests daily for the data set. This is just a list of different organizations that made the request for eBird data in August. Okay, so we've collected all this data. we manage it well, so we know it's not going to go away. But I still really haven't answered the question, can you really do anything with this messy data from, think about our observers as a sensor network, a semi-autonomous sensor network, where each sensor is different from any other sensor in the network. So it's an engineering challenge in the way that we develop the processes in which we analyze these data. But I would argue that we're fairly successful in the kinds of data visualizations and species distribution and occurrence maps that we can generate for this. For example, this is the map, we call these heat maps. On the left is of the breeding distribution of wood thrushes in the eastern United States. And up front, I'm going to apologize. Our analysis right now are only going to focus on the United States, the lower 48 states, not because of the eBird data, but because of the environmental variables that we selected early on to build our model predictions. Our goal over the next year is to do Western Hemispheric-wide analyses. So I'm sorry. But you can see, at least for the United States, that the way that our models show differences in relative abundance, where probabilities of detecting wood thrush in the major mining regions of West Virginia and eastern Ohio are where they're most abundant, and in the cornfield areas of Iowa through Ohio, where these birds used to be quite common, they're not that common anymore. The other thing that's exciting about how we've developed these models is that we can model estimate a species distribution for any time of year. So we can begin to see the importance of time in biodiversity and patterns of species occurrence across broad spatial scales. So this has been a quandary for us. It's this multi-scale species distribution modeling challenge. So our goal ultimately is to analyze species distributions at hemisphere-wide scales, but with fine enough spatial and temporal resolution where to allow a land manager to make a decision or an application in a very specific region. So we're using very fine scale variables but we're scaling these fine scale variables up to really large regional and year-round processes. So we do these runs annually. We run these models annually, and you'll see in the next slide why. But in our fourth run of the eBird analyses, these were the number of locations across the United States. It was about 500,000 locations where we had collected observations of birds that were used in the models. So what we do is we take the eBird data and that location and time information, and we link that data with land cover variables, fragment statistics that allow us to look at patches and fragments of land cover types in the environment. We use human population data, meteorology data, and in the past we've used NASA, MODIS, Landsat imagery to begin to look at and model these species distributions using a new modeling regime that we call the Spatial, Temporal, Exploratory models. So these models, though, are very, very data intensive, such that for us to run the models that we just did on 200 species required us to use 2.5 million hours of processor time. So we didn't do that with using one processor. We could parallelize the process and actually ended up using the National Science Foundation's EXCEED High Performance Computing Center in the University of Texas to use 5,000 processors simultaneously to run these analyses. And the output was predictions of patterns of species occurrence at the 3-kilometer grid scale across the entire continent. So what's exciting now, and then to hit home again on the temporal part, is that we can see the patterns, weekly patterns and species occurrence across the United States during the entire year that the bird is in the United States. So for this particular species, the Indigo Bunting, there's a small population that winters in South Florida, but most of these birds winter in Central America. They then move across the Gulf of Mexico, move quickly up into their breeding areas, avoiding cities. See the black hole where Atlanta is. And the center of their population remains. Then, beginning in August, they move back down, cross the Gulf of Mexico, back to their winter patterns, winter distributions. What's interesting, though, about these kinds of data is that it just not only creates pretty pictures, but we can see that there's variability in habitat usage of bird populations during the time that they're in the United States. So, for example, with Indigo Bunting, during the breeding season in the core part of its range, so this area, Indigo Buntings are found primarily in wooded areas where they nest up in trees and they eat insects. And they're not particularly found in pastures. But in August, the Indigo Bunting goes through a molt, and they begin to switch over their behavior to the kinds of behaviors that they exhibit during their winter season, the non-breeding season when they're in Central America. So they switch from preferring deciduous forests and move into pasture lands where they switch from eating insects to eating seeds. So these kinds of population level analyses are really exciting for us to be able to pull out of this large data set. We're also able to see how different subpopulations of the same species change over time. So, for example, this is another animation of orchard oriole, and where we think there are at least 2 different subpopulations of this bird in the United States. So, again, this is a bird that not only winters in Central America, but also in South America. It's a trans-Gulf migrant also, so it appears initially and moves in the Gulf and moves very rapidly up along the East Coast. Then they arrive more gradually in the central part of the country. The East Coast birds move back more quickly into, and then the central birds return. So follow this. When they hit the coast, now look how fast they move up into the east, and then several weeks later they move into the central part. Then they leave the east sooner, delay in the central part, and then disappear. So these kinds of patterns are allowing us to begin to ask questions, exploratory questions about how the phenology of a bird may impact the genomics of the bird and cause speciation in these different species. A lot of this data has been used by the Department of Interior to do its annual State of the Birds report. And the first time that USGS and Lab and Forest Service groups did the analysis, we looked at the patterns of occurrence of species on public lands. So, for example, we generated a whole series of these pie charts where we first estimated the the proportion of a population of a certain kind of group of birds, in this case arid land species in the southwest. And we found that about half of the populations of those birds were found on public lands. Then we can continue to look at that and see that most of those arid land species are actually occurring on Bureau of Land Management lands. So for the first time, we were able to show these agencies, these land managers, which populations of birds, which particular species are they most responsible for. What was most exciting to us was that we were finding, again, because of the temporal aspect of our analysis, the stewardship responsibilities change seasonally. So in both of these maps, or graphs, you can see that during the breeding season, in the center part, the highest proportion of both mountain bluebirds or willow flycatchers during the breeding season are found on U.S. Forest Service lands. But during the non-breeding season, for mountain bluebirds, they move down in elevation and move farther south and into Bureau of Land Management lands. So what these kinds of graphics are beginning to show us and inform land managers is that there needs to be more cooperation between these public agencies in being able to make sure that these birds are managed properly. The other area that we're looking on is beginning to study the details of migration analysis at the population level. So we really want to ask the question is, can these patterns in migration that we've seen with the eBird STEM model results, do they agree with theoretical expectations developed by banding data or radio telemetry data? So what we did was we gridded out all of the eBird checklists in North America. You can see like some of these dark red grids have as many as 50,000 checklists in them. We reduced that grid length to an area where we had a lot of the most contiguous set of grids. And then for about 100 species of birds, we estimated the center of the population as the bird migrates daily up into the breeding season and then back down. So what you can think of as this is a blob of birds moving back and forth, and we're plotting the centroid of those. And what you see are these plots where the blue line is the daily migration of black-throated green warbler as moves up into its breeding area, and our population level models show that they move very rapidly, and then the red line shows them coming back down at a much more slow rate. You can see that different species like this black-throated blue warbler moves back and forth following the same path, where the black-throated green follows a different path. So the really cool thing, though, we were able to do working with the Nature Conservancy in California was to look at species of special concern, particularly in the along the Pacific Flyway, and combine these two kinds of models where we look at the daily migration of birds and then their patterns of occurrence. So during, and this is for the long-billed curlew, a species of specific interest for Nature Conservancy. We can see that during the winter period, where in the non-breeding period, there's not a lot of movement. Not much happens until about early March, and then you can see the birds moving rapidly up into the breeding area in the upper plains. They only stay there for a couple of weeks, and then they start moving down again quite rapidly. But what's exciting and what we were able to find in this kind of analysis is that at the end of July, their migration stops. So the population quits moving, and we were able to identify real specific locations. These happen to be very arid areas in eastern California, Nevada, and eastern Oregon, near water where these birds stop migration and actually go through a period of several weeks where they molt. The TNC was interested in this because these were areas that weren't under any kind of management regime, except for Tule Lake, which is a wildlife refuge. So we were able to show them some new information by using this kind of data. Then they return. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that engagement is really the key. And if we don't get enough data coming into this system, then our results are not going to be very good. Regardless of how sophisticated the models are, regardless of how many processors we use to do these kinds of analysis, or how cool the visualizations are, if we don't collect enough data, our results are not going to be very good. The second is that you need to have sound data management framework to not only take care of these data and provide it back for the users, but also to maintain the systems over long periods of time. And then finally, we need to develop new kinds of analysis techniques to process this very noisy, very unstructured data. And that's, we've been able to use a combination of parametric and non-parametric techniques. So I always have to acknowledge our funders for this work, and particularly acknowledge all of the thousands of contributors to eBird. And I can honestly say that I didn't do any of this work. This group of people did. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. This is by miles a long shot the most fascinating, impressive citizen science, big data project out there, and addressing some really important questions in conservation and management, and increasingly basic biodiversity science. We only have time for one quick question, while I think Eric is next, Eric Mata. Perhaps could already come up and start setting things up. Back there.
Thank you for your talk. That was really amazing. The data sets are just incredible. Just a point of clarification. I wasn't sure, the data that you were showing, the modeling as the birds were migrating, was that data from just 1 year or from multiple years?
It's multiple years combined, so it's from 2006 to 2011. But the model was built to predict the patterns in 2011. So we combined data but focused the model for making a prediction on 1 year. That's the area that we want to go to now, and we're at the point where we're collecting enough data so that we'll be able to look at trends from year to year, annual trends on migration patterns.
Another quick question, perhaps?
That's good.
So it seems like there's a lot of work that goes into the modeling steps that is done, sort of internally in-house, and you wouldn't want researchers to be repeating all of your work. So what is, you think, the best next step to try and get the broader scientific community to integrate with eBird rather than you guys being this powerhouse of work? It's fantastic stuff, but you wouldn't want someone to go and just redo it in a slightly different way.
Well, there are two things that we do. The first is that we make the data available. So I don't think that there are many groups that could reproduce what we did in the kinds of analysis. But the other thing that we do is all of the modeling software is written in R, the R programming language. And that's published as a software package that you can freely access. So those are the two ways that we try to extend the community. The last time we looked, there were probably 90 different publications 90 different publications. Most of them not from us.